Thank you for attending Cannabis Crossroads, What's in Store for Marijuana Reform in Ohio, hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and the Natural Therapies Education Foundation. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, to streamline the appearance of the event today, we suggest that you hide non-video participants. To do that, click on the three dots at the top right corner of any participant box that has their video off and click Hide Non-Video Participants. Second, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation. Third, please note that auto-generated transcription has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the automated transcription or to hide it, click Live Transcript in the menu at the bottom of the Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the event page and on social media channels as soon as possible after the event. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event. Doug?
Thank you, Holly. I appreciate it very much. And hello to everybody. Thank you to all the attendees. I'm extraordinarily excited. I'm Doug Berman. I'm the faculty director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center here at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. And I really do sort of think our whole center came into being with a vision for a program like this at a moment like this. Specifically, our center looks at a variety of drug policy issues, but gives sort of marijuana reform extra special attention. And one reason for that is not just how dynamic this field has been, but because, as all the panelists here know, probably everybody attending also knows well, it's not just a will reform happen or not. The details matter, and matter incredibly importantly on the policy front, on sort of just good law development fronts. And so I'm extraordinarily excited that as marijuana reform heats up even more in the great state of Ohio, we're able to do this program with four terrific speakers who can give insights both on the ground of what's happening here in the state, but also provide a historical and a national perspective on both what's going on and where we may be headed. And so let me briefly introduce all the panelists so you know who you're going to get to hear from, and then turn to them sort of in an order of kind of providing background and opportunity to locate where we are now in context and forecast perhaps where we're headed on marijuana reform in the state going forward. So we have in alphabetical order, Mary Jane Borden, who's the co-founder and secretary of the board of the Natural Therapies Education Foundation. And right before we got on, she was described as an OG in this space. And I think that's a perfect modern way to think about the work that she's been doing in Ohio on these topics for decades. Then we also have Tom Haren, who's a partner at Frantz, was involved in the 2020 effort that got necessarily curtailed by COVID, and now is at the forefront of current initiative efforts to bring adult use marijuana reform to the state of Ohio, and has been active as a lawyer working on the current medical campaigns and licenses. Then we have, fortunately, Shaleen Title, who is a former Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commissioner, and we've been very lucky to have her at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center as a distinguished cannabis policy practitioner in residence for this year. And finally, certainly last but not least, because he introduced the first official bill to reform through the traditional legislative process, marijuana for adult use, that's Representative Casey Weinstein. He's House of Representatives, District 37, that covers part of Summit County. Let him talk about his perspective there as well. We're going to actually start, though, with Tom Haren, because I think, Tom, you can likely provide some background on your group's efforts before this year to get these issues to the voter through the initiative process, and then the ongoing efforts, as I understand it, to collect signatures and present through the direct democracy process a chance for Ohio voters to get to adult use recreational reform. And so with that, I've told each of the panelists that they've got 5 to 10 minutes that it will be liberally construed by me as the moderator. And then we'll have some time for some back and forth and some questions, and then also questions for the audience before we wrap up. So that's the game plan. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor. And I guess before I start, I do want to thank Professor Berman for all of his hard work in providing these platforms to talk in settings like these about marijuana reform. To the extent that Mary Jane Borden is one of the OGs of the industry, certainly Professor Berman is one of the OGs of marijuana academia, and all of the hard work that the Drug Enforcement Policy Center is doing is really terrific and really helping advance this issue forward. So first, I'll start with the effort that we had in 2020. That effort was a constitutional amendment effort that, we started the process of gathering signatures and submitting our proposal to the Attorney General's office right in March of 2020, like literally right before COVID hit and everything in the world shut down. And for a constitutional amendment, to get on the ballot, you have to submit over 400,000 valid signatures. And it became really hard to do when all of the public events were shut down, restaurants were shut down, et cetera. So we really lost an opportunity to gather signatures in big groups. And believe it or not, people weren't terribly excited about going door to door in the middle of a pandemic either. So that effort sort of fell by the wayside, and a similar effort began earlier this year with a very similar name, the Coalition to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol. The biggest difference between the two is that this effort is an initiated statute effort, which means we are in the process of gathering signatures, which we expect will be completed probably about the end of November, to then put a statute proposal before the Ohio General Assembly. And once that happens, the Ohio General Assembly will have 4 months to pass the initiated statute proposal as is. And if they decline to do that, then we have the effort to put it in front of the voters in November of 2022. And our proposal really builds on the existing infrastructure that we have in the current medical marijuana program. Under our proposal, it would be legal to possess up to 2.5 ounces of marijuana and 15 grams of marijuana extract. And we would also provide a framework for the issuance of new adult use licenses. And because we're building on this existing framework, it allows us to provide an alternative to the unregulated market as quickly as possible. So within 9 months, you will see, if enacted, a number of new adult use dispensary licenses, of which 40 adult use marijuana cultivation licenses would be issued with a preference to social equity applicants, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and up to 50 new adult use dispensary license, again, with a social equity preference. And those licenses are on top of adult use dispensary licenses that would be granted to existing license holders as well. And then after 24 months, the state of Ohio, through a new division of cannabis control, could reevaluate the market and issue additional licenses at that point. It was very important to our coalition to have a robust social equity component of this proposal. So we wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for social equity applicants to participate in this new industry. But we also wanted to make sure that we were moving this concept of restorative justice forward as well. So under our proposal, the Department of Development will create a new social equity and jobs program that will certify social equity participants based on the wealth of the business or the business owners, social disadvantaged based on membership in a racial minority group, the participants' color, ethnic origin, gender, physical disability, or long-term residence in an area of high unemployment. You could also be certified as a social equity participant if you, your spouse, child, or parent have been arrested for or convicted of or adjudicated delinquent for a marijuana-related offense. And you could also be certified based on economic disadvantage based on being in a qualified census tract. And then under this social equity and jobs program, The program would provide financial assistance like loans and grants to participants in the program who are applying for or who are issued a social equity license. We would encourage social equity hiring practices within the adult use marijuana industry. We'd also study and fund criminal justice reform efforts like bail, parole, and sentencing reform, expungements, sealing of records, legal aid, and community policing. We would study and propose reforms to address the social and economic impacts that the war on marijuana has had in Ohio. And I think most importantly, the program would fund direct investment in disproportionately impacted communities to enhance education, entrepreneurism, legal aid, youth development, violence prevention, and the arts. And this program would importantly be funded by new tax revenue generated by the adult use marijuana industry. And the way that our proposal is designed, there would be a 10% tax applied at the point of sale of adult use cannabis to a consumer. And all of that tax revenue would then go into several buckets. 36% of that new tax revenue would go directly into the Social Equity and Jobs Fund. 36% of the tax revenue would go into a host community cannabis fund, which is designed to provide tax revenue to municipalities that host adult use dispensaries so that we can ensure that we have dispensaries in communities across the state. One of the big problems with our current medical program is lack of access. We don't have enough dispensaries, and we want to make sure that in an adult use program, we encourage communities to participate so that their residents have alternative access other than the unregulated market. And then an additional 35% would go directly to fight substance abuse and opiate abuse specifically. And when we talk about that tax revenue, the first question we always get is, well, how much revenue are we really talking about? And there was a paper written by Finley L. Newman James, who at the time was a student at Moritz and was active in the Drug Enforcement Policy Center. And this paper estimated that if Ohio taxed an adult use market at 15%, like they do in Colorado, and had similar usage rates across its population, that an adult use market could generate near $625 million annually in new tax revenue. So our tax percentage is 10%. And so we think using those estimates that an adult use market could generate north of $400 million annually in new revenue to the state. So when we talk about social equity, that means that our social equity and jobs program would be funded with about $144 million every year. This would be the biggest investment, I think, in state history with an eye towards social equity. So again, we think we've taken meaningful steps to further the restorative justice aspect of a new adult use market. And one of the other things that's really important in an adult use program is home grow. And our proposal would also legalize home grow and authorize an individual to grow 6 cannabis plants in their house, or if there are 2 or more adults in a residence, you could grow up to 6 cannabis plants. And just like in almost every other state, we want to make sure that homegrown marijuana is not accessible to minors. So we have the same similar sorts of controls that you have to grow inside a secured closet, room, or greenhouse in a way that's not accessible to people under 21. So with all of these proposals combined, we really think we have sort of a best-in-class proposal, taking ideas that have worked in other states throughout the country and bringing them all together in a real cohesive manner that would really, we think, be a great thing for Ohio, a great thing for Ohio's marijuana industry, for consumers as well.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was extraordinarily helpful and a great overview. There's so many particulars I know to cover. I do want to make sure I don't forget to highlight that at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center's website, we've produced a chart that details the existing proposals, compares it to Ohio's existing medical marijuana program, and you should definitely go there. We'll get it in the chat the specifics of where you can download the chart, and also see some other efforts we've made to make it easier to get through, all those particulars between the initiative and the current HB 382 that Representative Weinstein has proposed. And I'm going to turn to him in a minute, and I'm going to kind of do a bridge between them with one follow-up question, Tom, particularly as I kind of think about the initiative process. First, I want to confirm, because I was unsure about this, your plans are to get the signature gathering done by the end of this month, so that by December, it'll be in front of the legislature, and they have that 4-month window, as I understand it, to act or fail to act on the proposal, at which point, if they don't act, you then collect more signatures to try to get on the ballot by this November. Is that an accurate description of the timeline you're hoping for?
Yes, it is.
And then the follow-up, and this is the one I've heard from a few people, with this being an initiated statute rather than a constitutional amendment, is there concern, or my understanding is it's possible that even if the voters were to enact the specifics you just described, but then the General Assembly next year decides it doesn't like the social equity parts, or doesn't like with the tax structure that the initiative has, they can just pass legislation and alter that. Is that correct, or a worry? And what can be done about that? If voters obviously vote for this and like the particulars, but then there's a risk that they don't stay in place very long. Yeah,
so at the end of the day, that's not something that I'm terribly concerned about, and maybe Representative Weinstein could talk a little bit more about the internal dynamics in the General Assembly. But we've started the process to engage with legislators on this topic. We think that marijuana reform is popular. It's popular across the country. We think it's popular in Ohio. We think it's, at this point, not just a bipartisan issue, but really a nonpartisan issue. We think it's something that legislators recognize is basically an inevitability. And the real questions are, when will Ohio take this step, and how should Ohio take this step? Professor, as we've talked about before, the federal government, I think, is going to move on this issue. There are now, both Republican and Democrat sponsored bills moving through Congress. This has been a priority of the Biden administration. Vice President Harris, I think in sort of a monumental statement in the vice presidential debate, said that, decriminalization was a priority for their administration, which I think was the only time we've seen a vice presidential nominee of a major party make a statement like that in a national debate. And the timing is really important here, because in Ohio, we have a statute, like many states, that says if the federal government adds a drug to the Controlled Substances Act, if they remove a drug or they change the scheduling of a drug, that change is automatically affected under Ohio law. And states have that because the FDA, routinely approves new drugs or new research, and things come out. But what that means is that if the federal government deschedules marijuana, it would be automatically descheduled in the state of Ohio. And at that point would be completely unregulated, completely untaxed. There would be no restrictions on where it can be grown, no restrictions on pesticides or labeling, no restrictions on whether you can or can't sell to minors, importantly. So the timing here is really important, because the choice really is, who's going to make the decision whether or not to legalize marijuana for adult use in Ohio? Is that decision going to be made in Washington, D.C., or is it going to be made here in Ohio? And if it's going to be made here in Ohio, which we think it is, we think that that's a decision that the legislators should make in the General Assembly, and that's why we've taken this path towards an initiated statute.
That's a wonderful segue to Representative Weinstein, who I assume agrees the legislature should be making the change here in Ohio. And so, with that, I'll just sort of give you whatever opportunity you want to take to describe your bill or the legislative process going forward, because I think that's itself part of kind of what's an uncertainty and a challenge. We've heard other folks in the General Assembly talk about possibly putting forward a bill, but you deserve credit, along with Representative Upchurch, for actually putting forward a bill. And so we'd like to hear about that, and probably hear more generally about your sense of what the current General Assembly is thinking on these sets of topics.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. My sense, Rep. Casey Weinstein from Northeast Ohio in the 37th House District. Essentially, I'll start by saying we've reached a tipping point, and over the past year or so, I've had conversations, a couple things. I've watched as states, including what I would consider peer states, like Michigan, legalize or decriminalize and move forward. We've reached a tipping point where we're almost at a point where the majority of Americans live in decriminalized or fully legalized states. We had what I would say is like a seminal Pew poll that came out, I think it was April of this year, that had 91% of Americans supportive of either full legalization. It was over 60% for full legalization and an additional 30 or so for medical legalization. And across all age groups except 75 plus. So we got to work on them, but support for full legalization across all groups. So, and then just in my personal life, my mom suffers from multiple sclerosis. So this has been something that I know has impacted her positively. Talking to my friends, frankly, I don't smoke, but talking to my friends, honestly, they do, and or use different marijuana products. And we've also got a robust and growing, stable and growing medical program here in Ohio. So when you take all this together, it's really clear to me that we have reached a tipping point. And I should add, and Thomas did a great job of providing an overview and talking about the bipartisan / nonpartisan nature of this. It is one of these few issues that has so many reasons to like it from so many different interest groups, that it's the nonpartisan issue, or it's widely popular on both sides of the aisle, all sides of the aisle. So it's time to move forward, right? And we're at the tipping point where if we don't, we really stand to lose out ultimately. So that's why I decided with my good friend and colleague, Representative Terrence Upchurch, to move forward. The ballot initiative, I'd love to get this done legislatively. It doesn't mean I don't in any way support the ballot initiative. I think it's initiated statute is a great way to go, because voters want this, and a lot of times the voters want things and the legislature is holding them back. And this is a situation where we're behind where Ohioans are. So, and I'm sorry, my dogs are going on. I don't know, it might be some reefer madness. The police might be closing in on my house right now. We'll find out here. But we have, I think, a momentum from the initiated statute and a compelling reason for the legislature to take action. And indeed, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have announced a framework to do just that, to move forward. So now we have three initiatives moving forward. So I just start by saying we are absolutely at a tipping point and then we have the federal movement as well. So we're at a tipping point where it's time to get this done and time to move forward.
Yeah, I'm tempted to joke the dogs are sort of like the State of the Union, audience, where they just want to clap every time you say something they agree with. But let me ask a couple follow-up questions to you, because I suspect, especially most of the folks tuning in and certainly all the speakers agree with that notion that the time is now and this is where all the action and momentum is. But my understanding is all the key legislative leaders in the state, the heads of the House and the Senate, as well as our current governor, are less than enthusiastic, if not quite oppositional. And I believe there was a recent quote from at least one of the leaders that Ohioans weren't ready for this yet, or something along those lines. And so, can this move forward without leadership? Obviously, what a initiated statute approach allows the voters to say, we want this, even if the legislative leaders are oppositional. But is your sense that you'll be able to get hearings, you'll be able to move forward and bring leadership along? Or is it, is that the kind of impediment that's going to require a change in leadership before we can expect to have this done through the normal legislative process?
So there's a stray dog that is just like out in my yard, and my dogs are going nuts. So you're just going to hear them going nuts upstairs, and there's nothing I can do about that right now. But anyways, so yeah, I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth, right? The initiated statute provides the urgency for the legislature to take this up if we want to have a say as elected officials in what this looks like. It so happens that my bill and even the Republican bill mirror fairly closely the framework of the ballot initiative, but that is the ultimate reason for us to move forward and do this through the legislative process. We were recently assigned to the Finance Committee chaired by Scott Olslager with Ranking Member Bride Sweeney, and recommend reaching out to their offices to urge hearings. We weren't meeting for quite a while over the summer when we filed the bill. There's a big backlog of legislation. We're about to start on the capital budget. So it's crowded, right? So that kind of energy and momentum behind it can help. Hearing from people on both sides of the aisle can really help us make the case. Things like this, just additional momentum that helps us move forward. So I think the fact that we have two bills, that we have federal legislation moving, that we're losing out on on vital funds to our neighboring states, and that we have a path for the voters to weigh in, which I'm confident that would pass overwhelmingly. That initiative will provide us the opportunity to get hearings on this late this year, early in the new year.
Wonderful. And I'll do one last sort of follow-up question that piggyback is a little bit off of a question that was in the Q&A to Tom, but to you as well, because you mentioned sort of growing supporter or events like this helping with the cause. Is there a specific way that Ohioans, individuals, whether it's policy groups, whether it's just other kinds of individuals getting their voice heard, is there a more or less effective way? Is it petitions? Is it saying they're going to vote in a poll in favor of Tom's proposal? Is it just writing letters to their representatives, getting their voice heard? Is there a particular kind of advocacy in this setting that you think is particularly important? Or, and to some extent, I'll reflect my own fear of some of the stigma that still exists in this space. Is there a certain kind of rhetoric and advocacy that may be counterproductive, at least in terms of the ways in which, as is true, I think in every field, certain advocates who are especially passionate may, push harder than particularly certain legislators are comfortable with? What's your sense of, kind of what can move the needle here, and what risks moving it the wrong way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I put in the chat the contact info for Rep. Olslager and Phil Plummer, who's the vice chair. Because Bride Sweeney, who is my Democratic colleague, is going to be supportive of getting this bill hearings. Reaching out is good. Social media is good. Elevating what Rep. Upchurch and I are putting out is good. At Rep. Weinstein, by the way, on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. There are definitely diminishing returns. If you were to reach out, I'd say reaching out once is fine. I've had great constituencies behind some other legislation that I've worked on, and depending on the legislator, they can get temperamental and kind of like it can have diminishing returns if the same person may be reaching out over and over again. But I think just sharing a personal story about the impact of this, my bill, I didn't really give it an overview. It is fairly similar to the ballot, but it allows for personal growth. It allows for personal possession. It expunges records. It creates a marijuana regulatory committee that will purposely, and intentionally go into communities that have disproportionately been impacted by marijuana prohibition. It'll re-enfranchise people and allow them to participate. It has a 10% excise tax, and the funds for that go directly back into the communities that host the retail locations. So it's even talking, or for the on a personal level, what that could mean to your community, what access to this could mean to you, to having more locations. Because right now in our medical program, we are severely limited on the number of dispensaries, and people are in medical marijuana deserts. So what does additional access mean from an affordability perspective? What does it mean to have home grow? And sharing those stories is powerful, and reaching out to your legislators matters. Follow them on social media, send a message through their page, email them, or call the office, or write a letter. I just pick one medium and sort of temper the outreach, but do it, right? And then keep elevating these messages of why we should do this. And it sustains and builds momentum to get hearings and ultimately to move this through the process.
Wonderful. And I may circle back to you before you have to, I know, leave us unfortunately at 1 o'clock, but I'll have one question particularly about data that might be a follow-up after Shaleen has a chance to talk about her experiences. But before that, I want to let Mary Jane have her chance to talk about, her perspective, which extends, decades, and maybe she also can talk about what she's found effective and maybe less effective at times, and when it comes to trying to lobby the decision makers here in the state and beyond. And so thank you very much, Representative Weinstein, and keep putting in the chat all of that as well. It's very valuable, especially for younger folks to understand fully how powerful, their phone alone can be without having to do more than that, and following and commenting in that forum. And so Mary Jane, we're the OGs according to Tom, and I'm happy to share that moniker with you. I'm even happier to give you the chance to sort of give your perspective both on how far Ohio has come already, but where you see it going, and your take on the proposals that are afoot and the prospects for actual reform getting done in the coming months and years.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today, Doug. I'm grateful to meet Representative Weinstein and Tom Haren, and of course Shaleen, who I've known tangentially for a few years. So what I thought I'd do is compare some of the things that are going on with what we call the Gong War poll. This is an organization that has been doing polls of the Ohio General Assembly. This is not a public opinion poll going out to the rest of the world. This is kind of in the bubble of the General Assembly, and to try to take the temperature of them on various issues. And they're covered, as you see right now, they're covering what they call recreational adult use marijuana on the poll that was just recently released. I believe that Holly's going to put that in the chat if anybody would like to follow along with me. In other words, the link to it on their site. So let's get started here, because you look at the first question, which it would be, should adult use marijuana be legalized in the state of Ohio? Well, and I'm going to get political because I must have to. We're in a the legislature, and what is it? It's political. Okay, so we're going to talk about Democrats and Republicans here. Okay, 36% of the Democrats say yes, that adult use should be legalized. Okay, and we have about 50% on this side. I call them like fence sitters, and then we have only 14% saying no. Conversely, a larger percentage, 43% of Republicans are saying that marijuana adult use should be legal. But on the balance of that scale, we see 43% saying no. All right, and they're not very much undecided on this. And so I think that largely the 43% of the Republicans have that, have that libertarian bent, and I would say that's reflective of them. But if you're seeing that this particular, I think the whole overall, there's only, if you take the General Assembly as a whole, there's only 40% that are favoring adult use. All right, and if you see that as wishy-washy between the no's and the undecideds, you're right. This has been a historic trend in the legislature. And they're obviously not listening to their constituents, because the recent Gallup poll showed 68% of Americans supporting adult use now, which is a huge jump from years ago. And before I go any further, I'm going to note that the stuff I'm talking about here next, I've actually been involved with. I was lobbying the legislature during the 2000s. I've run ballot initiatives. So that's kind of a personal story of my own, that I'm kind of been in the weeds concerning these various methods of legalizing marijuana in the state of Ohio. And so, as I said, legislating transients is kind of part of the bill, and that's part of a history of legislation in Ohio. And I think another thing construct to remember here too is that both chambers of the legislature have been Republican for years. I mean, decades. Okay, so this is the dynamic we work with. It's kind of more important to look at their numbers than it is with the Democrats, because they're going to be driving the ship here. Okay, and so also we look at the administrations. We had of course we got the wine right now in the governor's mansion, and then we had I can't say Representative Kasich, but had Governor Kasich before that, Governor Strickland before that, Governor Taft before that. So that these metaphors that we're talking about with respect to where the legislature stand has crossed over various parties being in control of whether it's the really mostly the governor's mansion outside the legislature. So that's what we're looking at here dynamically. So from 2000 to 2015, get this, 7 medical marijuana bills were introduced into the Ohio legislature, okay? Then they were done by Democrats, who's been Senator Hagan, and then Senator Yuko, who's now Representative Yuko, who's now Senator Yuko, and principally were the sponsors of these bills. Only one of those 7 ever got a proponent testimony hearing. Usually your sponsor will get an automatic hearing, but to go further than that, you get proponents to come in, as we saw in other legislation. Only one over 10 years and 7 bills. All right, talk about legislation trends. It says there was no really success until we got to 2015 and HB 523. Well, it's hard to tell the story of HB 523 without telling the story about ballot issues. Okay, so ballot issues. All right, according to the High Attorney General's website, and this is only since 2006, over 20 different petitions have been put before the High Attorney General for certification to gather signatures. Okay, and you have the process is you write your language, you submit it, and they have to determine whether the summary matches the full text, and blah blah blah. That's kind of the quick summary of the procedure. And most of these 20, with exception of Tom's, were constitutional amendments. In other words, modifying the Constitution to put the law in the Constitution. That's generally perceived as being, irrefutable. You can't really have to change it. You have to go back to the Constitution, or the initiating statute process, which is Tom is doing, is putting before the legislature. Okay, there are 20 petitions. Of those 20 petitions, 10 were certified. Okay, so that could collect signatures. And only one of those 10, only one actually collected its requisite signatures, went before the Secretary of State's office, submitted them, and got placement on the ballot. That was the infamous Responsible Ohio in 2015. Okay, and it's like in this space, if you don't know who Responsible Ohio is, you need to go back to your kind of the grade school level of the movement. So, and that's, in case you don't know, that was what they call the Monopoly Amendment. All right, the Monopoly question. So the dynamic that Responsible Ohio, there were many dynamics Responsible Ohio encountered, but one of them was that the legislature, I guess, angry, if you will, that a ballot issue had superseded them, that they didn't like the model. They put in their own, I think they passed this in about a week, their own resolution to put their own measure on the ballot to initiate what they call a monopoly question. Going forward, every single ballot issue has to now be evaluated on the monopoly question because it passed. It was called issue 2 and it passed. But Responsible Ohio issue 3 that year were lost. It was defeated. So we got the ballot, the monopoly question, but we got no medical marijuana, or really they had adult use component. So that's what it illustrates here, that the ballot issues face enormous obstacles, not only with the signature gathering, but with the hostile sometimes legislature, because you are doing an end run. And so still, they came back. I think some of them did, not all of them, but they came back in 2016 with a ballot issue. I'm not sure they were behind it, but the Marijuana Policy Project was, which is a national organization. And the ballot issue was called Ohioans for Medical Marijuana. And it began collecting signatures. I think it was certified probably around April, and it was had a very robust campaign, was very involved in collecting the signatures. Most people felt they would make the ballot. And all of a sudden, the Ohio General Assembly wakes up and says, wait a second, these people are actually going to put a constitutional amendment for the people on their own without us. And we're going to have to abide by it, because when it's in the Constitution, they don't get the right to change it. Okay. And it was like all of a sudden, the sleepy legislature wakes up, and again, kind of like in 2015 with issue 2, all of a sudden they get their act together, and within, I think, about 6 weeks passed HB 523. Okay, it was like introduced on the I could get the exact dates here. Introduced on the 14th of April, got to the House, passed May 10th, approved by the Senate on May 25th, case signature on June 8th. I mean, bam, bam, bam. So this, and after 16 years, 16 years, and they did it in 50 days. We waited 16 years, which I calculate out to be 6,000 days of waiting since 2000 for medical marijuana in Ohio. And so what motivated the change was obviously the ballot issue. And I think this is similar to what Tom is doing now with ballot issues, okay? Now, I think he's spot on. If you're going to get your mission, it doesn't cost you quite as much money and effort with the signatures, but you could get it before the General Assembly much more quickly, okay?
And Mary Jane, as you're talking about that, I wonder if you want to comment on, and I want to make sure it's mentioned in our conversation, there's a new bill to significantly expand Ohio's existing medical marijuana program. Do you think that's a direct product of the initiative campaign that's going on, or do you think, that I'm wrong to speculate the same kind of dynamic is in play where certain legislators, seeing what might be on the horizon are trying to kind of get in there and have their cake before somebody makes them eat it?
I like the analogy there. I hate to be so cynical to suggest that Senator Huffman is just doing this to gain political points, but the timing is really interesting. And he covers many of the same things that are in the initiatives. Of course, they won't have, the home grow will be one thing that will not come out of Senator Huffman's bill. But I think some other things, such as revising how the qualifying conditions work, so that you don't have to have that little set box. You have something that a physician actually recommends, and that's very important to people who have rare disorders. I could go on describing the things that are good about that bill, but you do have a scratch your head moment going, particularly now that I hear that Tom is going to is targeting probably December to put his statute before the legislature. The timing is kind of suspicious.
Well, and I don't mean to suggest any sort of untoward motivations. I just think your whole discussion kind of elevated, and I think it's a very important part to understand in this context, the way in which initiative efforts and the traditional legislative process sort of are in dialogue. And sometimes that's a tense dialogue, or, but that's in many respects why I'm a big fan of direct democracy, is it's a way in which you can move a conversation forward more quickly than it might otherwise when there's an opportunity for the people to speak directly. And maybe this is a good time to shift over to Shaleen, especially because she's had a role trying to create regulations in the wake of a ballot initiative in Massachusetts, and also has been looking at these issues across the country. And so I'm really eager to get your take on, kind of where Ohio is and where it might be going, and certainly advice for everybody about how we can make sure we do it the best possible way.
Great, thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge at the beginning, if you are new to this and catching up, or if you're outside Ohio and you know that it has important national implications and you want to understand what's going on, I really recommend the resources from my colleagues here at the DEPC. The comparison of the bill and the initiative and the existing law is really helpful. And just in general, it's really great to come here after being a regulator, because I think as a regulator, you dream about a resource where everybody could have access to the information, where you can elevate the dialogue to one like this. And it's so nice to see that Ohio has that. I also want to acknowledge Tom and Representative Weinstein for taking the time to be here, talk about the different proposals and demystify this process for us. It's really nice to understand this better. And then of course, Mary Jane Borden, I always stop and respect the OGs who have been doing this forever, long before it was cool or profitable. There was an email list that way predates social media that was on drug policy that I know Mary Jane was super active in. And I just tell people, if you like legal cannabis, you have people like her to thank. So this is a great panel. Thanks for having me here. I enjoyed looking at the Ohio proposals because I think in general, they do reflect a lot of learning between 2012 and now. I worked on the Colorado campaign, and I can definitely see the progress, especially home grow. Lots of people talked about this. In my work, not only is home grow really important as a consumer right, but also as a check on monopolistic behavior and corporate accountability, because you always have that alternative to grow at home. And I think that the tax provisions in both of these alternatives are great. There's a lot of specificity here. There's a lot of thoughtfulness as to where it will go. I think the first states, and Massachusetts in particular, we were very loosey-goosey as to where the tax revenue would go, and it's caused a lot of problems. We all are going to have different opinions, of course, as to where it should go, but I really like the specificity. So I mostly work on social equity, and I also think it's an important thing to comment on, because if you zoom out and you look at where we are with legalization, I would largely say it's been a success, except for social equity, because of course it's really difficult to undo damage that had been done for decades, not just by drug laws, but by tentacles that have spread affecting jobs, housing, custody matters, all of these different ways that generations have been harmed by the drug war. And so it's a lot to try to fix it. And we only started trying, just a few years ago with Massachusetts and California, and now New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, so many other states centering social equity. And so I think I would say my big headline reaction from looking at the proposals is that it's great to see social equity acknowledged, but I think we could do a lot more at this point in 2021 to implement the lessons that we've learned, especially in places like Massachusetts and California. So typically with social equity and repairing that harm, we're talking about three different things, which is three different parts of government, and that's expungement and criminal justice, which it's great to see both of the proposals include, and then designating cannabis tax revenue to repairing harm in those disproportionately harmed communities. And then lastly, jobs and licensing assistance. And it's great to see again that the initiative proposal has included this. But what I would note is that it uses language that we actually wrote here originally in Massachusetts that talks about a positive impact and promoting the disproportionately harmed communities as part of the way that you implement legalization. And when we wrote it in 2015, it made a lot of sense because we were just starting to look at social equity and seeing the data come in from the first states to legalize. We were in a different societal dynamic. I think back then, when I was working on the initiative in Massachusetts, we had the same situation where we weren't sure what the legislature was going to do. And there were two people of color on the entire committee. And when you work on a ballot initiative, you have to think about who's paying for it and who's going to pay for all the signatures to be collected. And there's a delicate balance there as well. So I think that from 2015, that was probably a groundbreaking provision to now, there's a lot of improvements that could be made. Specifically, there are comprehensive equity programs that have been put in place since then that are a lot more specific. If you look at Oakland, you see not just set-asides for licenses for social equity applicants, but also legal and accounting services, technical assistance, property, and all of these new benefits that have come up as a result of watching how the applicants face challenges and what they ask for. So I think being more specific or creating a process to add those benefits would be terrific. And then I would just close with, I think a big thing that we learned in Massachusetts and California especially is that when you have strong benefits for existing medical operators, that can really make a social equity program suffer or fail. And that's not an ideological position. It's not one that I held in 2015. It's based on data and evidence. It's based on what we've seen in all of these states. And so I do think it's concerning to see a playing field that instead of being leveled, we're seeing major benefits for existing medical operators, either a right to a license or a priority period. That doesn't bode well when we're thinking about how new entrants and small businesses are going to survive. I think there's great reporting out there from Jackie Borchard about the existing consolidation that's taking place in Ohio in the medical industry. And if we're aware of that, we can learn a lot from what other states have faced and potentially have a better program for small businesses, people of color, and social equity programs.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shaleen. And I want to both sort of wrap in a question and get Representative Weinstein in with the last question before he has to go, that really kind of connects to data and definitions. And so I'll see if I can put these together effectively. You know, social equity can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For some, it's, you know, being making sure there's a diverse representation in the industry. For others, this is kind of my criminal justice side, you know, lots of people getting expungements or record sealing and trying to undo that part of the past. You know, in your experience in Massachusetts, working on these issues, looking at other states, for example, were there particular data points, or this is one of our concerns, I think, from our center, that just data is not great on any of these frontiers. And one of the things that I want to make sure Ohio does as it moves forward here is builds a data infrastructure as well, whether that's defined in terms of, you know, how many record sealings are taking place, or who's working in the industry, or whose owner has ownership for a variety of the firms. So I'd like to know on the social equity piece, particularly, if there are, you know, sort of data points, or when you're comparing who's doing well in this space, kind of what you look to. And then that I'll transition then to Representative Weinstein to just ask, you know, with folks who are either, you know, not actively supportive or even resistant to reform here, are there particular data concerns, or are there, you know, I saw in the Q&A, somebody's asking about addiction rates. Other folks are, you know, I know concerned about driving under the influence and youth use. What you're hearing in terms of, you know, what folks may say and push back to you about their concerns, and whether there's a data answer or it's something else. And so that's a long-winded answer, a question trying to get kind of both of you wrapped into a data conversation, but hopefully it makes sense. And Shaleen, why don't you give your social equity take, and then Representative Weinstein, we'll hear if the dogs are still barking about it.
So our statute in Massachusetts lays out a research agenda. And so masscannabiscontrol.com has information on everything from baseline to youth usage rates to everything social equity. And it really helps because as we watched our programs not working, I think it's something like 8% of current applicants are in the social equity program or otherwise disadvantaged. We were then able to adjust our policies. So that's really important. Nationally, in the MORE Act findings, 4% of business owners in the cannabis industry are Black. And that's taking into account, you know, all of our equity program efforts so far. So it's pretty clear that nothing that we're doing has worked. And so we should stay at the same level or do more.
So, I mean, I can just add specifically, Professor Berman, were you asking about data on impact of legalization, or?
Really all of the above. And one of the questions I especially have, especially having the joy of working with Shaleen this last year, is, you know, do Ohio General Assembly members want to hear Massachusetts data? Or I've certainly heard in a variety of other conversations about criminal justice reform, if you say this is how California does it, that'll be the way in which they say, well, we don't want to do that because look at what's going on in California. And so I'm curious both, it's just on the substantive specifics, what you think, legislators and others care about, but even more broadly, kind of, where does data fit into this conversation as a reform effort, builds, and as particularly people in the audience may think about how they can communicate effectively to representatives, what are the issues that seem to be of biggest concern?
Yeah, so great question. Thanks for the clarification. Practically speaking, Ohio is more like that 25th, 30th, 40th state to do something typically, rather than one of the first. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So we can look at what has worked and what hasn't worked in different states. As Thomas mentioned earlier, taking best practices from those states and then looking at the implications of legalization in those states and seeing data. And one thing that does come up is traffic fatalities, traffic deaths. There's mixed results from different studies. You can find some that say there's been negligible impact, some that say there has been a tiny increase because of that. The other thing, practically speaking, from a political perspective is, Ohio is not going to, move forward necessarily on something after California, New York do it. But after that state up north, right, that I mentioned earlier, moves forward. Pennsylvania, which took a step forward, has a more robust and advanced medical program than we do. Louisiana is moving forward with decriminalization. So once you see a better, I'd say our Midwestern peers and states with sort of a similar political makeup that we have, or states that we just like to be better than, in the case of that state up north, then we have more compelling reasons to move forward on from a legislative perspective. But again, we'll look at the impact. It's nothing's perfect. No policy is perfect. But by waiting and seeing the real world implications of legalization, we can figure out what policies are resulting in the max impact for the minimum cost ultimately nationwide.
Wonderful, thank you. That was very helpful, and I know you have to go, so I just want to be sure to thank you and be grateful for your participation and encourage you to reach out to our center and others to continue to let us know what we can do to help to advance a thoughtful legislative conversation. To that end, Tom, I'm gonna loop you back. Oh, sure, please do. Go ahead.
On the data side, please read that article, because Pew shows 40% of drug arrests were for possession of marijuana, right? Possession or sale. 92% of those were simply for possession of low-level amounts of marijuana. This is a massive, massive incursion and injustice. By the way, it's not great for law enforcement to be focusing so many resources on nonviolent, low-level possession. So when we look at the impacts, we can also look at what legalization would do from that justice perspective, and we have really good data on that. So I just wanted to make sure we got that out there.
Very much appreciate that, Representative Weinstein. Singing my song, as it were, as a criminal justice reform guy, and so I really appreciate that. And maybe I'll turn to Tom then and poke you a little, because I do think some people notice, though you spoke to your eagerness to have, I guess, a study commission or the tax funding go into kind of follow up on the expungement or related type of remedial work, but that's not directly built into the initiative. So maybe talk a little bit about that choice in drawing up the initiative, and then I also guess I want to hear. You mentioned the tax revenue and where that's going to go more broadly. I assume that's going to be a selling point to voters if we're at the point where this is being considered on the ballot. But I'm curious your own take on this sort of data and advancement question. Obviously, for the 4 months it'll be in front of the General Assembly, that's a time to have your group and others lobby them with information. But just sort of curious about how you look into the political landscape and what you think could move the needle in terms of research or focal points for advocacy.
Sure. Thanks, Professor. When you have the types of campaign efforts like the one that we're involved in, we are limited by something that's called the single subject rule, which means our initiative has to be a single subject. So every new item that gets added to an initiative proposal, whether it's a constitutional amendment or an initiated statute proposal, you run the risk that the Ohio Ballot Board is going to split that effort into two separate questions at the ballot box, and that increases and doubles the number of signatures that a campaign needs to gather and makes it much more difficult to ultimately get something before the voters. So as the coalition kind of looked at what language we could add or how we could draft the proposal, that was sort of really top of mind. And ultimately, we felt like this was the most we could do as part of an initiated statute proposal, was to make sure there was a framework to study and fund these reforms so that they were front and center after those studies were conducted. I think it would be great if we had more direct social equity or more direct action on social equity from the legislature, but we're limited as a campaign as to what we can include within our own proposal. But again, I think we do a whole lot to advance social equity within our proposal, hundreds of millions of dollars directly to social equity causes that would not exist otherwise. But again, I think it would be great to have more robust efforts or more robust action from the legislature on things like expungements, automatic expungements, for instance. That would be a great thing, but not really something that we could include as part of our proposal due to that single subject rule. First, I don't know if that answered your question, or if you had another follow-up that you'd like.
No, that is what my understanding of why there wasn't more packed in there, and there's already lots packed in there for sure. So I understand that. The follow-up was about sort of the data point, or kind of what you think is going to be important in your campaigns, sort of efforts, both whether that's about trying to convince the legislature to adopt during that 4-month window when it's in front of them, or what you think are going to be sort of key advocacy points to the general public. I assume you have plans to run campaigns and commercials and do all that comes with every election cycle. But I don't know if you're zeroing in. You had mentioned, and we're grateful that you did, the student research about tax revenue. That always is an important point, I think, when you're speaking about these matters to the voters. But I'm wondering what else, if you're comfortable talking through, you think are the kind of key conversation points going forward over the next year, assuming, as I assume you're planning around the possibility that this ends up on the ballot.
Well, I mean, to be clear, we're not really focusing at all about a ballot campaign. Right now, we are laser focused as a coalition on engagement with the legislature, because we think and are confident that once our proposal is firmly within the General Assembly's hands and it's something that they have to deal with, that we can move the needle. And maybe some robust and vigorous debates within the legislature on the topic of marijuana reform. But as Mary Jane mentioned, and in my experience, it seems like Republicans are more favorable on this issue than we might give Republicans credit for. Speaking as a Republican, that it's not terribly surprising to me, because again, it comes down to, this is an inevitability, right? I think most people recognize that. And the question is, who's going to make the decision? Is it going to be Congress, the Biden administration, or the General Assembly? And how do we do it responsibly? And we think our proposal does that. And one more point on the topic of criminal justice reform. And again, just to be clear, ending marijuana prohibition is itself an enormous step toward criminal justice reform. Representative Weinstein's exactly right. If we could eliminate 4 out of 10 arrests and prosecutions overnight, that would be a great thing. And we think when you couple that with some of these direct investments into disproportionately impacted communities, we think that's a great selling point on the cause of social equity. And we think marijuana reform generally is popular among Ohioans. So candidly, it makes my job as spokesperson a little bit easier when I walk into a room and I sort of know going in that more than half the room is probably favorable to our issue and won't take much convincing.
Very good. I'm going to now shift, and this is going to bring in our other speakers as well. It risks being a little bit wonky, but I don't think it is, both because I know Shaleen knows how to talk about this in a way that's not too wonky, but also Mary Jane, I'm sure, has some thoughts. And I'll start with you, Tom, with the question, and then work our way around. And that relates to what the industry would look like once it's legalized. Here's the wonky piece, but we actually have another panel coming up in a few weeks to talk about it specifically, whether there are going to be any residency restrictions. In other words, is it going to be Ohioans that are going to get to be in charge of this industry, or can the folks who have learned how to do this up in Michigan, come in and take it over, or these multi-state operators that already seem to be finding their way in a consolidation of Ohio's medical marijuana industries right now. And then I guess more broadly, isn't there a growing concern? I think this is one of the questions flagged, big tobacco or other, super big players who, are eager to, as I think Project Sam has coined the phrase, put profits over people in this space. And how do we address those concerns? Does your initiative specifically speak to those issues? And what's your sense of not just, where you'd imagine the industry being, a year or two after legalization, which is probably inevitable at some point, but 4 or 5, decades down the line, are we going to end up just having another sort of big player in this space, and the local folks, ultimately get washed out?
Great questions. So the way that our proposal is structured, it takes the existing medical infrastructure and sort of builds upon that current existing framework. And the primary reason for doing that is the coalition really wanted to say, okay, how do we provide the most meaningful, quickest alternative to the unregulated market to Ohio consumers? And utilizing the existing framework was the best way to accomplish that. A lot of the questions about licensing and who will get licenses and what's that process look like, that's really regulated or relegated, to the new Division of Cannabis Control, similar to how it is under the existing medical program. The proposal does not include a residency requirement. Professors, as you probably know, these residency requirements are being struck down by courts sort of throughout the country on a dormant commerce clause analysis. And our existing medical program did not have a residency requirement. But what we do have is, again, 90 new licenses specifically for social equity, or 90 new licenses issued with a preference for social equity applicants, an opportunity for additional licenses to be granted by the Division of Cannabis Control. There are no hard caps on licenses in our proposal. The goal here is to have a framework and a program that can grow and evolve as consumer demand grows and evolves, so that we can have participation, including MSOs, but also including small businesses in Ohio's adult use program.
Shaleen or Mary Jane, you want to jump in on, sort of the look of the industry and what we can do to make it look like we'd want it to look like?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think that actually we got really interesting survey results this week. It's actually the first time I've ever seen research on what people think about both social equity and small and local businesses. It's from RTI. If you go to rti.org and search equity, you'll see it. And there was kind of this amazing finding where they asked about, this was in New Jersey. Do you care more about how fast the rollout is or whether it's equitable? And it was only 5.8% that said fast, and the majority said equitable, which is really surprising. And they also asked about local licensing. By far, favoring local residents was the thing people liked the most. That's consistent with my experience here too. And so it's so popular. I think we really want to try and retain as much of that as we can, depending on what happens in the courts. So I hope people will come and watch the next webinar digging into that topic. And then on big tobacco, my take on it is just about every marijuana law excludes people from the industry based on past conduct. Sometimes it's as expansive as excluding people based on cannabis offenses. Sometimes it's other felonies. I think you could apply that same principle to things that big tobacco has been found to have engaged in: substantial harm to public health, lying about their products for profit and addiction. Those things are very relevant to whether you should be running a cannabis industry. So that kind of exclusion is the approach that I would take.
I was going to answer kind of like how do we keep this in kind of in the local context, because a lot of particularly natural therapies, as an example, they found that when things come in, you're imported from overseas and imported from even far states, they degrade, you know, over time. And your fresh vegetables that you go to the farm market in the summer and can get yourself either right out of the garden are usually the best. That's why you love summertime. You can make all that nice fresh food. And I think the same applies to cannabis. So the closer that the cannabis is to the actual consumer, the better the quality of the product will be. And I think for me as a cannabis patient, and for the patients in general, the more medicinal qualities we can tease out of it. Now, I wanted to figure out, and I don't have my reports in front of me because I figured this all out before, but one of the proposals, I don't know if it was yours, Tom, or if it was Representative Weinstein's, had like a small growing clause in it, where it was like, let's say, I know it's 3,000 square feet in the smaller cultivation sites initially in Ohio, but these were particularly designed for the small artisanal grow, if you want to call it like that. And I think that's important consideration for two reasons. First of all, I personally like the idea of a collective or cooperative like they have with the farming community, where you can get a small group of people together, small farmers, because that's what they are, together, and they can share space, they could share equipment and things like that, and to grow for a small group of people. Okay. I know maybe this may sound strange, but I've often had in my mind, what if we took a big retirement community and turned its basement into a grow site, and the retirees, you know, the 80, 90, 100-year-old people can actually find joy in growing in that environment, growing cannabis, growing the medicine that they'll ultimately be using. And I'd like to
Rep
see
Weinstein
something
said
like
we had to work
that
on the
incorporated.
75 and over crowd. So I think it's great. I'm sorry you had to
I'm
leave
about there. So
with your specific proposal already.
right. Anyway, I just hope that, I didn't know if that was Tom's proposal or somebody else's, but I like the idea of the small cultivation, very small cultivation sites.
Well, and I guess that's a nice way to sort of piggyback to, and I'll kind of wrap us up here. And there's, you know, terrific questions in the chat. I tried to sort of incorporate some of them into some of our discussion, but, you know, kind of original thinking, right? Mary Jane just gave kind of an example of a way to specifically focus on an elderly population and imagine, you know, a co-op, you know, with that population specifically. But, you know, Tom, I know you've been paying attention to all of this in so many ways, both, you know, as a lawyer doing the work and then, you know, as an advocate and putting these proposals together. Shaleen, I know you've been looking also around kind of the state variation, and at times you notice a lot of variation, but at other times I must admit that, like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of creativity in that variation, that you know, it's kind of like we're trying the same thing, we hope to do it a little bit better here or there, we have the same sets of concerns. And so I'll sort of close with, you know, do you have interesting ideas for us to be thinking about where, you know, Ohio could possibly be a pioneer, right? I know there's lots of debate, especially with our new license plate, whether we can claim to be first in flight. But, you know, I'd like to imagine, you know, even though we're usually the 25th or the 26th state to do anything, we could be first in something in this space, or, you know, I guess maybe the question is, should we even aspire to some kind of vision like that? But I kind of want to just sort of have that as a goofy way to sort of open up, you know, your thoughts on, you know, is there something clever, creative, distinctive that could be done that ought to be pioneered? You know, if it can work in Ohio, the saying goes, it'll work anywhere. And you know, I have the joy of being in the ivory tower is this is the only way I think about things. You know, how can I come up with something that probably makes no sense, but, you know, sounds pretty cool in a law review article or something along those lines. But I kind of just want to open it up for all of you. You know, Mary Jane, you've inspired me, and I'm sure you have a couple more of those kinds of ideas of just something distinctive, interesting, you know, or at least maybe you've seen in another jurisdiction that you'd like to see Ohio have as part of its reality.
Oh, I'll go. Okay. I like to, one thing I wish I had all my cheat sheets right here next to me so I know which one's which. You know, I do know this stuff, but you know, there's so many. I can't believe I'm actually getting confused. You know, this is what we dreamed of 20 years ago. But another idea I think was I guess I'm old school. Okay. I go back 20, 40 years, and back cannabis was a social medium. I mean, when we were in our youth, our errant youth, it was all about sharing. All right. Everything was about sharing. And that metaphor is still out there, but under a medical program, it's so bottled up and it's so siloed that you have to get your, and I'm a patient, I get my RSO and I get my gummies and things like that, but they're only for me. What can we do to bring back that social connection that was so prevalent 20 and 40 years ago, that basically came from sharing? All right. Now I say that because there is a need. Nevada, for example, has started social clubs. All right, where you come in, you can have an infused meal, and maybe you can get some particular strain, and you could share it with your friends. Okay, so how can we implement something like that in Ohio? Would be my question.
It's a great question.
I'll jump in there if I can. I think every time we have a panel, I mention Spain and the worker-owned cooperatives and social clubs. So I really can't endorse enough what Mary Jane just said. I think we need to understand the culture because we already have a culture with the way that people use cannabis. We're not creating that from scratch. And we should serve that culture. And that's part of how we transition to the regulated market, which we all want to do. So I love the idea of social club, social consumption. I think that's the next big thing. I think worker-owned cooperatives is a great way to, not just make more, billionaires and millionaires. I think that we want to treat workers right. And then last, I just can't help but share, because it's so relevant, that here in the Boston area, Lester Grinspoon, who's one of the fathers of the legalization movement, loved to tell the story about how he grew a marijuana plant in his retirement home, and the workers would constantly cut it down and he would constantly replant it. And I think it's a good omen and a sign to come, because I love the idea of retirement homes and cannabis. Great note to end on.
Yeah, absolutely. I got my final pitch in a minute, but I'll let Tom go first.
Well, the one thing I'll just say is what a wonderful world we live in, where the idea of legalizing marijuana for adult use is boring and not creative, right? I mean, how far have we come over the last 20 years when the question is, what other cool stuff can we do? Because, this proposal is not exciting. But for us, that's also sort of the point, right? I mean, we wanted to put together a proposal that was sort of tried and true. And so to your point, Professor, we really think it's a pretty boring proposal, and that's a feature, not a bug.
Wonderful and well said and well pitched, especially in this context. And so I appreciate that. The point I want to make, and the point that I've done in some of my criminal justice work, it's certainly something that I think even fits into some of the earlier comments about concerns about a big tobacco or where the industry might be headed, is I just think we have so much important data work still to do, and particularly building up data infrastructure, whether it's about what social equity looks like or criminal justice reform elements of this, and the way in which you mentioned, Shaleen, earlier, the tentacles of the harm of the war on marijuana. And I think we're still starting to understand that and still have a lot more work to do there. Also, what the marketplace is going to look like, who's in it, who's driving it. Those are things that I fear the industry is going to have really great data on, and they have reasons they're not going to want to share, and they're not going to want to help regulators and public health officials sort of figure out what that might mean in ways that continue to return me to the idea. And I think you've got this in your proposal, Tom, that significant amount of the money goes back into the government structures needed to really understand this emerging marketplace and where it could take us, and that's part of the reinvestment dynamic. And so I'm hoping that will remain an important part of a variety of parts of these conversations, and that and maybe this is just my own jealousy that for us at the little Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, where we're trying to figure all this stuff out, and then ArcView sends us things that shows the industry already knows what 7 different people like about this kind of gummy, and that's how capitalism works, right? I think that's one part of it that I always want to be not only understanding of, but that's why we can turn this into an industry and be hopeful it's going to satisfy consumer preferences we would want in a responsible way, but it also means that the public's going to be at a data disadvantage relative to the industry, and that's often part of where the challenge lies. And so with that, I certainly want to allow any last thoughts, though I think we did an excellent job along the way. I want to particularly thank the other folks at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, Jan and Holly, particularly for helping us to get this together. We're going to continue talking about these topics, I am sure, for the year ahead, although maybe Tom is hopeful we can get it done in 6 months at the legislature, so we won't have to talk about this next fall. But you know, I'm hopeful for him, but not particularly optimistic that this is going to happen overnight, because it's taken this long to get us to this point. But I encourage everybody who attended. Thank you so much for your attendance, and please let us know, particularly about subtopics that's worthy of more time. As Shaleen mentioned, we have an event in a couple of weeks to talk about residency restrictions and what that might mean, both in Ohio and nationwide. We're also planning a tax panel to sort of focus on taxing good, bad, and ugly at times, and the best way to go about taxing cannabis in a rec regime. I also want to emphasize we've produced a bunch of reports and a bunch of other materials at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. Please go check all that out, and please give us feedback about this kind of programming. We were quite grateful. A lot of people registered. I know there's an extraordinary amount of interest here in Ohio about these topics, and we want to make sure we attend to them in a way that's useful for everybody. So with that, thanks again to everybody, and have a great Friday afternoon, and go be social, to follow up on Mary Jane's suggestion. It's a nice thing to be, if you can, safely in this modern day era. So thanks again, and be well, and please stay in touch.
Go Bucks.
Yeah, and go Bucks. There you go. Exactly. Thank you all.